Welcome to the Religion Media Centre's Big Interview. Our guest today is Robert P. Jones, who is founder and president of Public Religion Research Institute in Washington, D.C. PRRI is a non-partisan research organisation which examines the relationship between religion, culture and politics in the US. Robbie has written for the New York Times, Time Magazine and The Atlantic, and this week sees the publication of his latest book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. It's on the shelf behind him, but I shall hold up a copy here so that you can see it. And it's really great that you could make the time to be with us this week, Robbie. Thank you very much indeed and welcome.
Oh, thank you. I'm very glad to be here.
Last time you were with us at the RMC, it was to talk about your book, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. And I wonder if you could just tell us briefly about the journey you've taken between these two books.
The last book, White Too Long, was essentially a memoir of trying to think about this entanglement between white supremacy and American Christianity through the lens of my own family story and kind of history of the South, where my family is from, the American South, really through the 19th century. So that book also had a fair amount of sociological data showing how those attitudes are still with us today, particularly how kind of anti-Black racism is still with us in American public opinion today, and particularly among white Christian churches. So the new book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, as the name hints at, is my attempt to just pull this thread a little further and to go back and trace this as far back as I could and try to look for, like, where are the deeper roots of this in American history. And so I trace it back to 1493. So not 1492, the year that Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but 1493.
And not 1776, the Declaration of Independence, and not 1619, 1620, when the Mayflower sailed and when the first enslaved Africans, we think, arrived on American soil. So tell us about why you're challenging the sort of origin story of America.
Well, origin stories are really important. How our in the beginnings determine a lot about how we see ourselves today and how we got here. So this is vitally important. It's one of the reasons why, in the American context, we're fighting so much over our history right now. So as you said, there has been these kind of competing things over the last few years during the Black Lives Matter movement. Is 1776? All the white men standing in Philadelphia signing the Declaration of Independence, is that the beginning of the country? Or is 1619, as you said, when first indentured servants that have become enslaved in the U.S. context arrive in the British colonies and what were to become the British colonies? So, but I think we need to take it back a little further. And the main reason for that is that if we only start in 1619, we miss a fair amount of European interaction with indigenous people in this country. And that's what gets missed, I think, from that. So I'm actually, I think my position is to say, like, a kind of yes and to the 1619 project. Yes, we need to kind of widen the aperture beyond, this little postage stamp of, the white men in their knickers signing the Declaration of Independence, but we need to move it back even further so that we fully see the first interaction of Europeans with indigenous people here.
And you say 1493. Tell us what happened in that year, which makes it your starting point for understanding where America is today.
It's critical for the Americas in particular, because that's the year that Columbus returns to Spain after not setting in foot in what is the United States, but in the Americas in general. But he returns and he is needing a political and ultimately a religious justification for further exploration, further colonization of these lands that he so-called discovered. And he needs a kind of moral justification for how to treat the people who are on those lands. And so who does he reach out to? It's the closest thing that we have to international law at that time, and that is the head of the Western Christian Church, the Pope in Rome. Now, I should say that this is just not a Catholic story. This is before the Catholic-Protestant split in the Western Church. So this is before the Church of England splits off from the Catholic Church as well. And so this is the head of kind of all of Western Christianity that this appeal is made to. And what he gets is actually a papal bull, an opinion from the Pope at the time in 1493 that gives him explicit permission to go back with the blessing of the church. And essentially the logic is this thing became known as the Doctrine of Discovery. And the logic was essentially this, that if they encountered any lands that were not occupied by Christian people and not already under the control of other Christian nations, they had the blessing of the church and the permission of the king to occupy, steal, kill, and even these documents spell it out. I mean, they say, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Like that's a direct quote from this Vatican document. And this really sets the dial, sets the compass, the moral compass for the interaction of Europeans with indigenous peoples all across the Americas.
And it wasn't the first papal bull to do this, was it? I mean, it was a sort of 50 years or so before that the first papal bull came out. I'm ashamed to say I'd not heard the term Doctrine of Discovery before. Has it not been part of shared history, that term? I mean, I guess I was aware that popes had given their blessing to exploration and settling and so on, but I hadn't actually heard that term used.
No, I think that's right. It hasn't gotten a lot of play in America, certainly not in American history textbooks. And, if you brought this up in our conversation 3 years ago about my previous book, I wouldn't have had a lot to say about it either. So it really has been the journey of doing the research on this new book that made me realize, this is actually quite significant because of how it sets up a kind of moral and religious lens for white Christian people of European descent, in America that is very much still with us today, and is at the heart of some of our deepest political conflicts in the country today. So, and I have to say that it's indigenous scholars that have really held this up and have for 50 years been saying, no, this is actually quite significant.
It's an interesting week, isn't it, for the publication of your book? You've got the sentencing of those involved in the January the 6th insurrection at the Capitol. But you see a direct line, do you, between events there at the Capitol and the embracing over centuries of this doctrine of discovery?
Well, it's notable that the insurrection on January 6th. If you go and you look at the images there, what's notable is that there were obviously Trump flags and Trump T-shirts, but there was also this juxtaposition of Confederate flags, this kind of symbol of white supremacy, and Christian flags and symbols, right? And so this idea of a kind of white supremacy and Christianity, this toxic blend of these things, were very overtly on display that day, including through the breached, doors and inside the U.S. Capitol. And so it is, I think, this. And if you've heard, I think President Trump's overtures, over and over on the stump and on the campaign trail, you'll hear these things like, if you don't elect me, we will not have a country anymore. And so if you interrogate that a little bit, who's the we, and what kind of a country is he really talking about? He's really talking about a kind of white Christian America that he's talking about defending here. And so this is very old and very much connected to this idea that the U.S. is intended to be, by God, a kind of promised land for European Christians. And that is who the country is for.
And you've written that connecting the histories of Native Americans, indigenous nations, with the histories of enslaved people is the key contribution, one of the key contributions you hope to make by writing this book. Why have those two narratives not been joined up?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, they are absolutely connected historically, but I think the way history has been treated in the U.S. is that these are just in silos. So there is Native American history over here, there's African American history over here, and there really hasn't been, even in the reckoning that we've had in this country over the Black Lives Matter movement in the last few years, has largely focused on African Americans, right? It hasn't really brought the indigenous story into the frame so much. And I think that even well-meaning sort of Christian churches, for example, that I've been in contact with and talked to over the last few years after the last book came out, it's largely been this reckoning with the legacy of slavery, of the enslavement of African Americans. Very little conversation about what came before that. And so I think there's a way in which it is simpler that way. And I suppose people think, well, we clearly had a problem with slavery, and if we get that problem right, we're good. Right. We've addressed the problem. But what's deeper than that, I think, is this sense of Christian kind of white supremacy, Christian entitlement and superiority that led, not only to enslavement of African Americans, but justified the genocide and forced removal of indigenous people that came before all of that. So it's actually one history. And the way I put it in the book is, if we look upstream from what even good, well-meaning people have, white people have called the Negro problem or the Indian problem, if we look upstream from those two things, what we see is what I call the white Christian problem.
And so failing to see the connections as a way of being able to close one's eyes to the problem.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, or at least minimize or mitigate, the deeper roots of the problem.
Now, you came from Mississippi. That's where you grew up. And it's in Mississippi that you have 3 examples in the book of the connections between the history of indigenous peoples at the hands of white people and the history of enslaved peoples. Mississippi is one of those examples. Can you explain the connection that you're making in Mississippi between the death of Emmett Till in 1955 and the sort of the big expulsion of indigenous people from that state?
So you say Mississippi is my home state, and so I spent 3 chapters on Mississippi in the book trying to tell the story. But essentially, the guiding question is, how do we get a society that acquits 2 white men who murder a 14-year-old African-American boy for whistling at a white woman in a store? How do we get that, right? And it's all white, all male jury. If we trace it back, what gives us this society? And so, when you look back, the most immediate story is, of course, the Jim Crow South and the disenfranchisement of African Americans. And it's notable that one of the reasons why there was an all-white jury for the Emmett Till trial when they were trying his 2 murders is that there were 0 African Americans even registered to vote. So they weren't even eligible to serve on jury. That's how complete the disenfranchisement was. And this is a county that was about half African American, right? So half the county on the basis of race is like completely disenfranchised from the political process. Before that, why is Emmett Till from Chicago? Well, he's from Chicago because his family fled persecution from the South, part of the Great Migration from Mississippi to Chicago. And then there's slavery before that. And if we keep going, well, what happens before there? And that is the lands needed to be vacated. And there was the Trail of Tears and the forced removal of Cherokee, Creek, and Chickasaw Native American tribes from that land before that. And, I trace it all the way back to the Hernando de Soto in 1541, who was the first European to, set foot in that area of the country and claim the land for Spain in 1541. So that's 400 years prior to the birth of Emmett Till. And yet this legacy, again, by what right? Well, because of the superiority of Christianity and the superiority of European civilization. That was the logic, right? And that logic was still operative, keeping African Americans off the jury. And it was still operative in terrorizing, kidnapping, and torturing and killing a young African American boy for violating and for kind of a fairly innocent flirtation with a white woman that was absolutely taboo in that hierarchical society.
And you talk about the early 19th century, that the period when indigenous nations were sort of forced off the land and forced north. So I think it was sort of 18 out of 23,000 of them were sort of forced out. So I guess that's another reason why you had an all-white jury, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And also a reason why there's very few people left to tell this story on the ground in Mississippi, because most of the indigenous people were forcibly removed to what is now the state of Oklahoma. And that's the ones who didn't die along the way. Upwards of 20% of them actually died during this forced migration, which took place in the dead of winter.
So the idea that, this land is our land is the idea of white settlers coming into the Mississippi and the sort of Delta region, forcing off the people who already live there, and then disenfranchising African Americans who had been brought in originally to work on the plantations there.
Yeah, that's right. And it is one continuous story. And the through line there, again, is people who are largely European descent, animated by a version of Christianity that justified this hierarchical, really racist view of the world.
The Doctrine of Discovery is something that sort of justified that. Do you trace other justifications as the process continues through, as the settlers come in, as they force people away from the land? Are there preachers sort of preaching the doctrine of discovery and its effects?
Sure. I mean, absolutely. I mean, the one way to even reread the Civil War, right, is through this lens. And so there's plenty of, for example, I grew up in the Southern Baptist Convention. That word Southern, right, is not just a geographic marker. It is about Confederate sympathies. It was actually broke off from Northern Baptists just before the Civil War, and the same leaders that really manufactured this religious split were the same ones saying the prayers and blessing the Confederacy. Just a few years later. So that vision, again, that they saw this hierarchical vision, white over black, men over women, et cetera, was all baptized in a religious view.
The second half of the title of your book, The Path to a Shared American Future, depends on the work of Commemoration and Repair, as you call it. Just briefly tell me about the work that is being done in Mississippi, both in relation to Emmett Till and to the forced expulsion of Native peoples.
Well, it's much further along, actually, with the Emmett Till story. So I'll tell that one briefly. So, if you had gone to the Mississippi Delta, which is kind of the northeastern part of the state in the Mississippi River Basin, rich cotton land still today, you would have seen no historical markers of any kind commemorating Emmett Till, and even though that name is known around the world. And it wasn't until a few decades ago, or just before the 1990s, really, that there was any efforts at all at local commemoration, and that didn't get off the ground until the early 2000s. So it's a very recent set of, but there was this intrepid group of people, black and white, and one of the reasons why I have this kind of more hopeful tone in the book is because of these efforts at the local level. So these were, remember, this is a very rural place. It's very poor. It's very rural. It's very, even the county seat town of Sumner, Mississippi has like 600 residents. This is very, sparsely populated, which means these families all still know each other. And so, it is the great grandfathers of enslavers and the great grandfathers of the enslaved and tenant farmers getting together, deciding to try to do something to have a better future for the kids. So it was really amazing to kind of get to know, spend some time on the ground, get to know this group. And they've had local efforts to now place all these historical markers. And just recently, that local work has resulted in President Joe Biden just a few weeks ago, actually announcing a new national monument that will be made to Emmett Till and his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, that'll be jointly placed in Chicago and in Mississippi. That'll have the support of the federal government, and this, that will ensure that this story, I think, gets told for future generations.
What about with regard to indigenous peoples?
Yeah, that is much slower. As I said, part of the issue there is that there's only a very small indigenous community left in Mississippi. The bigger part of them were moved to Oklahoma. But even there is starting to be repatriation of remains, for example, that were sitting in museums and sitting in private collections. There's been a very respectful movement to start honoring those remains, removing those, and sending them back to be reburied in Mississippi, of telling these stories, I think, in a way that really hasn't been done in years past.
You make a distinction between the word reparations, which you say is perhaps appropriate for African Americans, and restitution for indigenous peoples. Just explain why you use different terms for the processes that you think need to happen.
Well, this is something I actually learned from reading, indigenous scholars and activists. And I think the key difference in the American context is that, indigenous people here have a whole set of federal treaties that actually are, law. They've been violated, but many of them are still technically still standing. So there is this legal apparatus. And what we hear from Native American scholars is that, it's not just reparations or even like a cash payout, but that is appropriate, but it's actually just honoring the U.S. treaties that were given to indigenous people. Most of the time, that involves two things. That is giving land back that was taken in violation of treaties. So there's a whole land back movement, and then the other thing is sovereignty, and so respecting the sovereignty of Native Americans actually on the reservation lands that they continue to hold today.
Where are white Christians in this work of reparation and restitution?
It's complicated, for sure. On the one hand, I've been kind of inspired that there have been, more than a dozen Christian denominations in the U.S. that have officially repudiated the Doctrine of Discovery, and that's just happened in the last couple of decades. Really, since 2009 was the first one. The Episcopal Church in America was the first one to do this, but many have followed suit. The World Council of Churches has done the same. The Pope Francis and the Vatican issued a statement just this past summer that was sort of a half repudiation of the Doctrine of Discovery, but I think further than they've been willing to go. So there is I think, a growing awareness of how toxic I think this has been inside of Christian churches and Christian theology and kind of political ethics as well that's being addressed. On the other hand, I will say that among many white conservative Christians in the country, particularly those aligned with the Republican Party and Donald Trump, there's a kind of doubling down on the other side. So there's a big fissure happening, I think, in the U.S. now over this.
Right. And I just wonder if you could just say a little bit about Pope Francis' stance on it, because you suggest that he's gone a long way, but actually maybe he's not gone far enough.
I was very hopeful when I saw he went on what he called a penitential pilgrimage across Canada, actually, which also has a very similar history with genocide and displacement of indigenous people there. And he did kind of go. He met with leaders. He spoke, very passionately. But when he was asked, for example, in a press conference by a Native American journalist or by an indigenous journalist about the Doctrine of Discovery, he basically drew a blank, and it seemed that he didn't even know what they were talking about, which is quite astonishing, given that there's been decades of activism on this part among indigenous people. But then he goes back, and the Vatican, a couple of months later, does actually issue a statement. It's billed as a repudiation of the Doctrine of Discovery, but if you read it closely, it is yet to take full responsibility by the Church and by the Pope and by the Vatican for his forebears. It basically says, if there were people who, did this on our behalf, we apologize. And if there were leaders who took this to mean this and went and did these dastardly deeds, we apologize. But it never says we, the Church, were wrong, right? And to me, the first step in an actual confession would be to actually accept responsibility and to sort of, confess it and your own role. And I think the Catholic Church has still not quite gotten there. I've put it this way, that, if this were an apology that I gave to my spouse, I think we'd still be talking.
Right. Okay. Well, that's good, at least. I'm aware that certainly the Episcopal Church has been pretty engaged in some of its dioceses with reparations for slavery. What's going on in the other denominations on that issue?
Yeah, I think in the U.S., the Episcopal Church has certainly taken the lead, but there are a number of other denominations that are engaged, in this as well. I mentioned the World Council of Churches as well. But it's interesting. The Episcopal Church, it's a kind of multi-pronged thing. There's the denomination itself, but then there are local seminaries that have their own kind of reparations programs. There are even single dioceses. The Diocese of Maryland, for example, where I live, has its own kind of program. And I think that's where we are actually, is that, there's clearly not a clear, this is what reparations looks like, and we should all just do that. And I think we're very much at the very beginning of this conversation. So people are trying, I think, various things to see what's happened. I will say one thing that I have yet to see, and that I would like to see, and I really think it's going to be an unavoidable question, and that is not just raising new money for reparations or a scholarship fund or those kinds of things, but actually asking the question, what about our endowments? What about the money we already have accrued? And what's our responsibility there? And we have yet to really see a sizable a commitment or a serious conversation about taking a look at those, the holdings in those coffers.
How much is the whole question about, who America is and the stories of origin, how much is that going to feature in the campaign coming up to the next presidential election? I mean, it's absolutely central to it, isn't it?
It is, my day job. I'm the president at PRRI, and what we mostly do is we do public opinion polls. So we take the pulse of Americans on a whole range of issues. And it was just a few years ago. I think we came to the realization that while we still, we're going to poll on issues, we're going to get issue priorities, all of that, that they weren't these individual issues, even things like abortion, immigration, healthcare. They're important, but they're actually not the biggest drivers of the divisions in the country anymore. It really is about American identity. And that's the reason why our biggest, fights these days are over banning books that have certain kinds of histories in them. They're over librarians in public schools, curriculum. We got a state banning AP African American history, another state, Arkansas, saying that they will no longer count AP African American history toward graduation for high school students.
Just tell us, what is AP American history?
Oh, it's advanced placement. It's a way to get college credit for during high school. But these are very rigorous courses, that are they're nationally vetted kinds of courses, and so it's quite remarkable for a state to say we will no longer recognize this
because they don't like the version of history that's being told.
That's exactly right. They don't like the version of history that's being told, particularly around slavery, the Confederacy, et cetera. So I do think this fundamental question, if you really want to kind of think about what's dividing the country, particularly with Donald Trump still at the top and his "Make America Great Again" slogan, which is absolutely about identity, we really are back to this question. Is this country a kind of divinely ordained promised land for European Christians, where everybody else is kind of a second order citizen, or are we a pluralistic democracy where no matter what your race or your religion, everyone stands on equal footing before the law? And I think we're still we've never fully answered that question in the U.S. and it's still very much with us and at the heart of our divides.
There's hope in your book, but I wonder what are the potential trajectories that you can draw over the next 2 years?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to be realistic here. It may get uglier before it gets better in the U.S., and particularly with this next presidential election cycle. I mean, I think it's maybe we all have to put on our seatbelts, for this one. It's going to be rough, I think. But here's the thing: when we asked about this view among Americans, whether Americans actually think this, that America is a divinely ordained promised land for European Christians, it's only 3 in 10 Americans that agree with this. So two out of 3 Americans reject this view and embrace a more view of a pluralistic democracy. So that's the hopeful piece of this. The challenging part, though, is that it's half of Republicans, right? One of our 2 political parties, a majority of that group actually believes this, right? So it's still animating one of our 2 political parties, which, by the way, today is 70% white and Christian. So we're increasingly got a kind of white Christian party that believes in this kind of older Doctrine of Discovery view of the country. And then another party, the Democratic Party, that is only about a third white and Christian, that looks much more diverse, is much more embracing of pluralism. And ultimately, you look at young people, that's the way the country is going, right? But there's going to be a very bitter fight. And I think the reason why it's a bitter fight is because of the demographic changes in the country today. And there's a kind of last stand mentality, I think, that has taken hold.
I was at the Greenbelt Festival recently. It's a liberal Christian festival in the UK, and a comment was made to the American writer David Dark along the lines of how we smug British rather enjoy observing the American culture wars and the American evangelical scene because they're even worse than our own. So my last question to you is, what would you like a British readership to take away from your book for and about ourselves?
Well, it's very clear that these roots are American because they're British, right? In many ways, that sort of we inherit. These. It's worth noting that King Henry VII was not wanting to be left out of this whole Doctrine of Discovery and issued his own edicts, kind of on the same logic to John Cabot and his sons to kind of go out under the same logic and colonize. So it's still very much there, and I think we certainly have seen more echoes than I think many of us on both sides of the Atlantic would have thought. In the Make America Great Again movement and Brexit, right? I mean, there I think not the same. Certainly, there's very different histories, and particularly recent histories. But some of these dynamics here, nativism, isolationism, white supremacy, those kinds of dynamics, I think, are still alive in both of our nations.